Yeah. Okay, everybody, let's take a seat. We're having such a great time here with Rabbi Mark. And I could tell you nice stories about him and Roz. You know, you could be tempted to think of him as just a theologian and this highbrow thinker. I thought of him that way a little bit until I learned that he and his wife sing in unison. What's the name of the song? Oh, come on, but you did it, and I remember it. It was Redneck Woman, of course, yes, you know. And when I saw that side of Mark, I realized there was another side, a country western loving side. And, no, Mark, it's been so wonderful having you because you bring such humanity and such erudition to the subjects that you're teaching on, and we're all deeply appreciative. So, why come and teach us? Let's welcome Mark again, if we can.
This is probably going to be the most difficult session after lunch.
Are you on, Mark? Is it powered on? Headset?
Thank you. Okay, there we go. Now we have some power. Yeah, I need this amplification because then I can shout and be loud enough to wake you up. So, okay. Well, this morning we talked about bilateral ecclesiology and the new Jewish landscape. And as I promised, we're now going to talk about bilateral ecclesiology and the new Christian landscape. Well, just as bilateral ecclesiology implies something about our commitment to Jewish authenticity, so it implies something about our commitment to partnership with the Christian churches. These are really two sides, and it's easy to miss these two sides. Some people, when they think about bilateral ecclesiology, if they even have ever heard the term, they see it as this desire to have this pure Jewish expression of faith in Yeshua. But they may not recognize that just as essential to this vision is this appreciation for the positive contribution that the churches bring. An assessment that recognizes all of the problems for the 2,000 years and realizes the tragic character of the way in which the church has dealt with the Jewish people. And at the very same time, it doesn't dismiss the entire history of the church as if it's a disaster, a catastrophe. And so it's very important for us to look at what's going on in the Christian world right now and to ask, what does it have to say to us about our identity as a Messianic Jewish movement in relationship with this world? And so now we're going to take our little tour through this Christian landscape. Again, I'm not trying to cover everything significant that's going on in the Christian world. I'm just picking out a few things that I think are of special significance for us as Messianic Jews looking forward. And what I wanted to do is first talk about the survival of Jewish Christianity. Now, what I mean by this is, in some ways, it's a reflection back on how I thought and many of us as Messianic Jews thought. at the beginning of the Messianic Jewish movement. We saw Jewish Christianity as that which existed before we came on the scene. And then we came on the scene to replace Jewish Christianity. Jewish Christianity was supposed to morph into us, Messianic Judaism. Of course, by Jewish Christianity, what I mean is any kind, an expression of Jewish life that is part of the wider Christian church and which has no qualms about seeing itself using this terminology, Christianity. Now, the place we have to start is with the recognition that most of us have. There are many more Jews in the churches than there are in the Messianic Jewish movement. And what I mean by many, I mean many-fold. No, it's impossible to get accurate statistics, either on the number of Messianic Jews that there are, meaning Messianic Jews within the Messianic Jewish movement who would identify as part of that, and how many Jews there are in the churches. But perhaps there are 10 or 20,000 Messianic Jews that would identify as Messianic Jews. And most likely there are somewhere between 2 and maybe 400,000 Jews in churches. So it's not just there are a few more of them, you know. There are a lot more of them. Now, it's easy to ignore the fact because they're scattered, you know. You'll have one here and one there and 2 in that church and another 1 in that church. And so the experience is always, oh, this is just a totally isolated marginal phenomenon. But when you put it all together, their numbers are really quite substantial. Now, most of these Jews within the churches have no longer any desire to identify as Jews in any significant way. That's true for probably the majority of them. But it is not true for all of them. In some segments, in fact, of the church, there still are organized bodies of Jews who identify as Christians, but also identify as Jews and seek to support themselves in that life. It's something that most Messianic Jews are not even aware of. So I spoke a little bit about Jewish Catholics. And I particularly talked about the Jewish Catholics in Israel. You know, that's one particular location and expression. There are also many Jewish Catholics in France. And there are some organizations that they've created. Many of you may have heard about Cardinal Lustiger. Cardinal Lustiger was a Holocaust survivor, a Jew, who became a Catholic as a teenager during the time of the war, and eventually rose to become the Archbishop of Paris and a cardinal in the Catholic Church, and one of the closest advisors to Pope John Paul II. And what was so striking about Cardinal Lustiger, when he was named Archbishop of Paris, he did some interviews in which he spoke about himself as a Jew. Said, I am a Jew. It's not something in the past tense. It's not that I was a Jew, I am a Jew. And this provoked a great deal of controversy. But over the period of his tenure as Archbishop, he did not back down from that at all. And in part, through his influence, there were many Jewish Catholics who began to more strongly identify as Jews. I was in France in February because the book Searching Your Own Mystery, which is on the table there, is now translated into French. And so I spoke in several different French contexts, and I met many Jews, many Jewish Catholics with a very strong sense of Jewish identity. And it's interesting, they do not have a strong connection with the Jewish Catholics in Israel. They pretty much have their own world. There are also a group of Jewish Catholics in the English-speaking world that also have a somewhat separate Anglo-Saxon identity. They have their own organization. It's called the Association of Hebrew Catholics. And it was founded, I think, in the 1980s. It's existed for a long time. And it was originally one of their causes was to try to establish a Jewish rite, R-I-T-E, within the Catholic Church. So these are fascinating phenomenon that I don't think we can afford to simply ignore. In the last few years, I'd come to be acquainted with another phenomenon like this that challenged me even more because I had known a little bit about the Jewish Catholics. And this phenomenon consists of the Jews in the Russian Orthodox Church in Russia. Now, we're all familiar with the Messianic Jewish movement in Russia. You know, that especially became such a powerful phenomenon in the 1990s. But before that, in the 1960s and 70s, in fact, around the same time as the birth of the Messianic Jewish movement, there was a kind of move of thousands of Jews coming to faith in Yeshua and entering into the Russian Orthodox Church. And one of the major figures behind this was a priest, a Russian Orthodox priest by the name of Father Alexander Men. Both of his parents were Jewish. His mother had come to faith in Yeshua before he was born, and so he was baptized at a very young age and raised in the faith of Yeshua, but grew up with a very strong sense of his Jewish identity. And he wrote books about Yeshua and that accentuated his Jewish identity, developed relations with Jewish scholars in Israel, and became a kind of evangelist in a quiet way in Soviet Russia. And as I said, through his influence, he gathered hundreds, thousands of disciples, and many of them were Jews. In 1990, he was martyred. He was killed with an axe. Nobody knows exactly who did it, but it was probably the KGB who had hated him. And so Father Alexander's work, though, remained. And he had a close friend who was not Jewish, but who was carrying on his work to a certain extent. And he established a parish in Moscow that gathered up a lot of these Jewish disciples of Father Alexander. And that parish still exists today. And I was in Moscow 2 years ago. We had our Helsinki consultation meeting in Moscow then, and went to this particular parish and also met a number of these people, including the brother of Father Alexander. And it was really an astonishing experience for me. I mean, this is like a different world, you know? And we had one meal with a group of these folks, and they just broke out into singing all of these Israeli folk songs and started dancing, you know, the hora around the room. And I mean, it felt like the Messianic Jewish movement in the 1980s or something, you know. These are Jews in the Russian Orthodox Church. You know, and what's so amazing is this movement came into existence at the very same time as the Messianic Jewish movement here, without any visible connection. it's been these experiences that have been very influential for me in having to think through these things. I can't just ignore what I saw. And there are Jewish Anglicans who are very proud of a long history of the Anglican Church's involvement in Israel and with the Jewish people. Another thing that's been very striking to me, and Rabbi Rich can attest to this too, has to do with seeing what's happening with friends and brothers and sisters in the missionary world. A lot of my concerns in the past about the missions is that I saw the work that the missions did as often a doorway to assimilation. You winning Jewish people to Jesus, but basically then bringing them into a church, and basically through their being in the church, ultimately they assimilate and their children and grandchildren are no longer Jewish. What we've been seeing in some of the leaders of some of the major missions over the last few years is a new kind of recognition of the dangers of assimilation and the need for Jewish disciples of Yeshua to find a way to be a community together and to support one another in maintaining their life as Jews. In the past, the focus was so heavily simply on getting people saved or getting people into relationship with Yeshua that this other dimension was not so pronounced. This is significant because many of these leaders in these missions are ordained in Protestant churches. They're ordained Baptists or Pentecostals or whatever, and many of them are active and involved in evangelical churches. But they're also beginning to see that there's a danger here and a problem, a challenge that has to be faced. I think this is all very, very significant. They're not planning to leave their churches. These folks in Moscow that I dealt with, they weren't planning on leaving the Russian Orthodox Church. I don't think they will. The Jews who are part of the Association of Hebrew Catholics, or these Jewish Catholics in France, or these Jewish Catholics in Israel, they're not going to be leaving their church. But they all are looking for some way to continue to live as Jews so that they have Jewish children and Jewish grandchildren. I think what we have here is a kind of something like the seeds of a kind of ecumenical movement of Jewish disciples of Yeshua. Something that has never really happened before. And that's what we're trying to do in the Helsinki consultation. And right now we're working on putting together a meeting next summer, which will be unlike anything that's ever happened before. It would bring together a group of leaders from the Messianic Jewish movement, including the entire spectrum, including the missions world, along with Jewish Protestants, Jewish Catholics, and Jews from the Russian Orthodox Church. We want to keep it small enough to have a deliberative meeting, maybe 60 people, and see what happens. We're not even starting saying this is what we want to do. We want to bring all of these people into the same room and share what we're seeing and what we're thinking, but then see what happens. What I hope will happen is the emergence eventually of some kind of collaborative movement, because I think this is something the Spirit is doing. So that's one thing that I see happening. Of course, if this did happen, then if the Jews within the church who have a sense of their Jewish identity could issue a wake-up call to all of those slumbering Jews in the churches, the potential for some kind of significant visible expression, far more significant numerically than anything we've ever seen in the Messianic Jewish movement, would be possible. I would appreciate your prayers for this initiative. So that's one phenomenon. The other phenomenon that I don't really have to tell you about, because I'm sure you're all very, very familiar with it, is this widespread Christian attraction to Judaism. I mean, this is one of the things we deal with most pressingly within our own movement, within the Messianic Jewish world. You know, there. In some ways, you might say it's a great problem to have, that there's a set of people who love us so much, you know, that they want to be with us. As I've said this morning, it can be a challenge, but I think we have to look at it and say there's something here with positive potential, that we have Christians for the first time, really, looking at Judaism not as this inferior religion, but as this tradition from which they themselves are seeking to draw. This is expressed in part through those emergent communities that I was referring to earlier. Because a lot of those groups, like the Igbo in Nigeria, there are maybe 30 million of them, and most of them are Christians. And so this move, as a whole tribe, though, they have the certain customs that are more like Jewish customs, and they have some historical memory of identification with Israel. And so it was natural for some set of them to more radically identify with the Jewish people. So this kind of phenomenon is found in various places around the world. We also have this B'nai Noach, this Noachide movement that exists, with those mainly, again, from a Christian background, reconnecting with Judaism in this way, through seeking to live under the laws of Noach. I've heard a bit about it, but I don't have firsthand contact with this. But it's another significant development that's related to this Christian attraction to Judaism. Now, there have been some unhealthy expressions of this that we've had to deal with over the years. And I'm thinking of what some of you will be familiar with, the two-house teaching. You know, this sort of, it's sometimes called the Ephraimite movement. And I think this is a problematic type of phenomenon. One of the things, though, that I see as problematic about a movement like this is that, again, the tendencies are often hostile to the entire history of the Christian church. It's not just that they both miss the Jew-Gentile distinction on the one side and the positive contribution of the Christian church on the other side. And so, in order to be, I think, healthy, this Christian attraction to Judaism has to find a way to respect both of those two fundamental principles. That there is a significant Jew-Gentile distinction that needs to be honored, and that the Christian church needs not to be denigrated. But if this Christian attraction to Judaism can navigate within that frame of reference, it could be something very, very positive. We've seen in some of the changes that have occurred in First Fruits of Zion over the years, I think an attempt to try to find a way to work within these parameters. When I was when I was in France in February, I met a community called the Beatitudes community. And it's a Catholic community. It has priests and lay people in it, celibates and marrieds. And from the very beginning of their community, they've had this strong attraction to Judaism. And so many of their members learn Hebrew. They do some of their liturgy in Hebrew. They observe Shabbat and many other Jewish practices. But they're Catholics. And again, this was a rather astonishing experience for me. You know, it's helpful to encounter these realities that do not fit your categories. You know, that gets you to ask questions. Now, many Messianic Jewish congregations are populated largely by non-Jews. There are some Messianic Jewish congregations that would identify as Messianic Jewish congregations, where the only member of the congregation that's Jewish is the rabbi. My own sense is that over the next couple of decades, most likely what these groups that would identify as Messianic Jewish congregations, my hope at least, is that what they would become in effect is something more like a Christian Jewish roots church. One that respects, again, these two fundamental principles of the Jew-Gentile distinction and the unique contribution that the church has made through history, but at the same time is seeking to bear witness to something else, this other impulse of Christian love for the Jewish people and Christian love for Judaism. I think there's a place for such churches. They are on the Christian side of the bilateral relationship rather than the Jewish side. But there's no reason why there can't be a diversity of ways of being related to Judaism and the Jewish people on that Christian side. Perhaps this whole phenomenon of Christian attraction to Judaism should be understood in terms of Rabbi Stewart's notion of converging destinies. It's all part of this sense of God working within the church and the Jewish people over time to bring these lines together. And so this is my hope, that what we can see, this Christian attraction to Judaism develop in a healthy way that makes a contribution to God's purpose for that relationship between the Jewish people and the church. The third development. I spoke this morning about the shifting center of gravity in the Jewish world and the Messianic Jewish world. There's also a shifting center of gravity going on in the Christian world. In the Christian world, the shift is from the West and the North to the global East and South. From Europe and North America to Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The church is not doing very well in Europe. The church is holding its own in North America, but not really going forward in any dramatic way. Whereas the churches in Africa, Asia, and Latin America really continue to move forward and make progress. I think it's significant that this is occurring especially through the Pentecostal and charismatic movements. Not exclusively, but they're the most dynamic expression of these developments in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. given that that is the case, and there is this at least spiritual connection between those developments and the Messianic Jewish movement, this development that could look like it's of only remote significance for us, I think actually in the long term could be of some great significance for us. One of the ways we can see this also is through some changes in Christian Zionism. As I mentioned before, Christian Zionism in North America was often something that expressed this prophetic, eschatological, apocalyptic type of orientation. It was mainly about the fulfillment of biblical prophecies. There was an article written recently in the journal First Things that was about the new Christian Zionism, that was talking about the new Christian Zionism of the global South and East and how it's different from the Christian Zionism of North America and Europe. It said that it was a kind of Pentecostal prosperity teaching, but that morphed from being individualistic to being collective. Because these cultures are not individualistic the way in which our culture is. And so the orientation, the fundamental verses were those from Genesis 12 that spoke about God blessing those who blessed Abraham. And the idea was that if a whole nation blessed Israel, that God would bless this nation, as opposed to simply God will bless me as an individual. Now, I'm not commenting on the theology one way or the other. That's not the point. The point is to see that in many of these countries where people have maybe never met a Jew, they're receiving teaching about the importance of the Jewish people, the enduring importance of the Jewish people in God's purpose. And it's not simply focused on the eschaton, on what's going to happen at the end. It's focused on the sense that the Jewish people today are still God's chosen people in the world. That's significant. I know of many Messianic Jewish teachers who do a lot of globetrotting, more than I do. Mine is mostly in Europe and North America, the places where the church is dying. But those who do more of the globetrotting in the global South and the East, and there's this tremendous interest in Messianic Judaism as well as in Israel. I know this is the case in Korea, in particular, but that's just one illustration. The initiative toward Jerusalem Council too has both advanced this and encouraged it, but also connected with it. They've got a lot of connections with leaders in Anglican churches in Africa, who again want to support Messianic Jewish life. I think that sometimes there were many of my own friends who were rather skeptical about toward Jerusalem Council too. I'm not. I think it's an important initiative, and that some of the connections they've made in these circles are important for the future of God's work within the church, and ultimately the future of the relationship between the church and the Jewish people and the Messianic movement. I don't know how. For all of these things, I'm not offering you like a picture of how each of these pieces fits together. There's no way of knowing that until it happens. I am singling out things that I think are actually important pieces, and we'll only see as the years go along how the pieces of the puzzle actually come together. A fourth development. This relates to my book, Searching Her Own Mystery. And in that book, I tell the story of the Messianic Jewish Catholic dialogue, a dialogue that Rabbi Rich was involved in as well for many years. And it's been a fascinating experience. It began in the year 2000, and in that form went on till 2016, and we're now trying to figure out exactly what the next stage will look like. This is something which still proceeds like under the radar because there's been nothing dramatic that has come from it. But it's really quite astonishing to me that the last 3 popes have all thought there was something important about Messianic Judaism. What are the chances of that, really? I mean, how many bishops are there around the world who even know what a Messianic Jew is? How many cardinals are there? Not that many. And yet, the last 3 popes in succession have all thought that there was something of tremendous historical importance happening among us. And that's why they began this conversation with us. And in this conversation, there's the possibility in the coming 10 or 15 years of seeing some kind of action from the Catholic Church that is an official action that moves in some of the directions we were talking about earlier in terms of dealing with the Jews in their own ranks, as well as in relationship with us. Because we've pressed them on these questions, not just about ourselves, but about Jewish Catholics. I believe something like this will happen. If it does, again, it's one of those game-changing type of developments. Because whenever the Catholic Church takes some kind of official action, it gets noticed by everybody else, and everybody has to deal with it and respond to it. The Catholics were really the first to take a new step in relationship to the Jewish people at Vatican II with this famous document Nostra Aetate. And partly as a result of that, the other churches, many of the other churches began to follow suit. Similarly, whenever the Catholic Church acts, the Jewish people pays attention. And if the Catholic Church took some dramatic action in dealing both with Messianic Jews and with Jews who are Catholics, this would again become an issue that the Jewish community would have to respond to. It couldn't simply ignore the way it largely ignores us. I think that our support for this kind of initiative on our end is important because it expresses, again, our sense of appreciation for the historical reality of the Christian church. Now, the Catholic Church is not the church from our perspective, you know. The church is bigger, a bigger reality. But what's characteristic of the Catholic Church more than any of these others is it has a total identification with the entire history of the church. It has the same approach to Christian history that we Jews have in relationship to Jewish history, whereas most Protestants don't have that in the same way. And so when we are willing to engage in this kind of conversation with them, we're in a rather dramatic way saying we see good things in the history of the church. We don't just see bad things. We do see some bad things. And those bad things are part of the basis of our conversation. But it's also the case that part of what gives us the hope for the relationship is they've already seen a lot of those bad things, and they've been at the forefront of repenting for them and taking responsibility for them. And so I think that for anyone who sees the good in bilateral ecclesiology, looking for these opportunities to reinforce positive directions in relationship with the Christian churches is something that we ought to be doing. Okay, before we get to our biblical passage, one just final summary, might say, or conclusion. And this regards simply the need for this more nuanced, updated vision of bilateral ecclesiology and missiology. We have to be big enough to recognize where there are other forms of Jewish life that are expressions of Jewish life in Yeshua, sometimes even within the Gentile wing of the body of Messiah, that are beyond our own boundaries as a Messianic Jewish movement. Now, I think that what we are doing is absolutely essential in this process. Without what we're doing, none of these other things ultimately will come together. The fact that the Helsinki consultation exists is in part because of the Messianic Jewish movement. The fact that there's a possibility of some of these different currents I talked about earlier finding one another, it's because of us. One of the things that was so surprising to me was when I learned about Hebrew Catholics in France and Hebrew Catholics in Israel and Hebrew Catholics in North America and England, and realized that they didn't have a lot of serious relationship with one another. It could be that this event that we bring together in Dallas will be the first time when they're all together in the same room. So that part of what we end up doing is even bringing these groups of Jewish Catholics together. So our role, I think, is central here. It's a role, though, not just of being the be-all and end-all. It is a role of being a kind of joiner, a mover, a bringing of things together. In the past, we have been good at breaking things apart. And now I think what we're being called is to be a movement that brings things together that have been separated. This is a noble calling, an essential calling. If we don't do it, it won't happen. And at the same time, it calls for humility on our part. A recognition that even when it comes to Jewish life in Yeshua, we're a part and not the whole. In the early years of the Messianic movement, one of our failings was hubris, or a kind of Messianic Jewish triumphalism. The sense that we are it. We're the end times movement, you know? It's us. And I think this vision is a different one. This is one where we are part of something that's much bigger than we are. But we're a central part of it. And as I said, if we don't play that part, the whole thing doesn't happen. But we're still only one part. And that humbles us and brings us down to earth. And means that we're no longer in this position of looking so much at ourselves. One of the things I was particularly struck by last week when I was in Kansas City was again this conviction that in some way that I don't understand, that Messianic Judaism ultimately is the key to the unity of the whole picture. Now, I don't know if some of you I'm sure have heard of Father Peter Haken, but many of you haven't. Father Peter was a leader in the Catholic Charismatic Renewal. He was also one of the early founding members of Toward Jerusalem Council II, the first Catholic participant within it. He was really the main Catholic engine behind the Messianic Jewish Roman Catholic dialogue coming together. And he passed away this last summer. He was with us at the UMJC conference perhaps 2 years ago and spoke. I was just so happy that he was able to do that. And before going to this Kansas City conference, I reread one of Father Peter's books that he wrote just before Toward Jerusalem Council II came together. He wrote it in 1994. It was called The Glory and the Shame. And it was a book about God's work in the Pentecostal charismatic movement in the 20th century, starting with the Azusa Street revivals and the Pentecostal movement at the beginning of the century, going up through the denominational movements and the Catholic charismatic movement. What is so impressive there is he spends a lot of time talking about the Messianic Jewish movement. He, at that point, did not have significant personal contact with it. As I said, this was before TJC2. But he wrote about how the Messianic Jewish movement was, in his view, central to the whole thing coming together. And he saw it as fundamentally, it's like the ultimate principle of unity for God's people. Now, that's really quite remarkable. His last book was a collection of essays. The title was Azusa, Rome, Zion. Azusa, Rome, Zion. That captured his sense of the progression of history, of what was happening, and where it all ultimately led. So, when I look at the Christian landscape, what I see is this multifaceted, diverse reality in which God is moving in really dramatic ways, and in which we need to have our eyes open to seeing things that perhaps we haven't seen in the same way before, so that we can cooperate, that we can play our part and be faithful to it. Now, our biblical text. We've been going through Acts, and now, we talked about the Jerusalem Council focusing on the Gentiles, and then Paul and taking Timothy with him in order to bring the decree from the Jerusalem Council to the Gentiles. And now Paul's coming back to Jerusalem, and he's meeting again with James after the great success of the work that he's been doing. But there's a problem, we find out. The problem comes from the reports that are coming from outside, that Paul's not only teaching something about these Gentiles and the fact that they're not obligated to live according to the Torah, that they have a freedom to develop in new directions, but that he's teaching that Jews are basically free from the Torah as well. We'll just read this. When we arrived in Jerusalem, the brothers welcomed us warmly. The next day, Paul went with us to visit James, and all the elders were present. After greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard it, they praised God, and then they said to him, "You see, brother, how many thousands of believers in Yeshua there are among the Jewish people, and they are all zealous for the Torah. They have been told about you that you teach all the Jews living among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, and that you tell them not to circumcise their children or observe the customs." What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come, so do what we tell you. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Join these men, go through the rite of purification with them, and pay for the shaving of their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself observe and guard the Torah. But as for the Gentiles, who have become believers in Yeshua, we've already sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from fornication. Now, the reason I picked this text is because we again have this meeting of Paul and James. And these are two Jews, two Jewish disciples of Yeshua. James we know about. He's, a very zealously and strictly Torah observant Jew in Jerusalem. Now, what we've seen in the book of Acts is that, as soon as Paul leaves the Jerusalem council, the first thing he does is circumcise Timothy. And we also see that he takes a vow. He does a number of things that point to us to the fact that, Paul's still Torah observant too. Obviously, he can't do it quite the way James can. He's not living in Jerusalem. He's spending a lot of time with non-Jews. That's his main calling. He's certainly going to have to make some kinds of compromises. And at the same time, it's very clear that he's doing what he can to continue to live as a Torah-observant Jew. And that's what James says. He says, look, you've got these rumors circulating about you. We know they're not true. And you have to demonstrate, everybody, that they're not true. And so what we see here are two Jews who are both committed to the Messiah and both committed to the Jewish people and both committed to the Torah. And yet their spheres of operation are completely different. James hardly ever deals with a Gentile. He's living his life completely in a Jewish world. Paul is traveling all over this pagan empire, and he's having contact with Gentiles every day. And that's his primary calling and work. But he's still a Jew. And when he comes back to Jerusalem, there's this recognition that there's a joint work that they're doing. And in the same way, my hope is that someday we'll have the kind of relationships with Jews who find themselves in these other worlds than we are. And where we have the sense that James and Paul had here, that we're on the same side. We're on the same team. We're about the same work. And that we belong together. Okay, time for questions and discussions. So, first hand up from Joshua.
Thank you, Rabbi Mark. I was wondering if you could kind of expand, or actually really just answer, where you see the development and acceptance of post-supersessionist theology among different denominations, and who we can kind of see as closer to being, for lack of better terms, use the catchphrase, allies moving forward.
Yes. It's a good question. And there isn't really a simple answer for it. One of the reasons I've been that I've been enthusiastic about interacting with Catholics is that in that environment, I find two elements present that I think are really crucial for the kind of post-supersessionist theology that we want to promote. On the one hand, they have very clearly officially renounced, let's say it positively. They have definitively affirmed the irrevocable election of Israel. And they still will use a term like the Old Covenant, but only with the phrase that John Paul added, the Old Covenant never revoked. That was the phrase that John Paul added to it. So it's old only in the sense of it's older than the New Covenant, but that it's an Old Covenant that just continues, has never been never been revoked. So they are very clear, very, very clear on that. But they are just as clear on the centrality of Yeshua and the fact that all salvation comes through Yeshua somehow. And then they basically, at this point, still somewhat throw up their hands in terms of knowing how these things go together. I think we could actually help them on this front. But they hold both of these positions. Now, there are some, my experience to a great extent is that within the rest of the Christian world, you have the more liberal churches, which have been willing to at least give some kind of affirmation of the Israel's enduring covenant. But then they've tended to do it more within a kind of dual covenant context, in which allows you to keep a safe distance. That's the thing about, I mean, dual covenant may sound really nice, this idea Israel has its way, the church has its way. But it allows you then to basically say, okay, what God is doing something great with you, we bless you, go and do it. But it doesn't really affect us, We're doing something different. There are the other churches, of course, the evangelical churches, which are clearer on Yeshua and Jesus. Some of them also are very clear on the irrevocable election of Israel, although for most of them it plays out more in terms of eschatology rather than in terms of the actual life of the Jewish people today within this world. And so what I would say is, rather than seeing church bodies, where I say the whole church body is one, where that I think we should be engaging with. It's more, I find particular theologians who, and groups of theologians who capture what I think are the most important truths and bring them together. One of the things, one of the things that David Rudolph and I are doing, along with two Christian theologians, one Catholic and one Protestant, Kendall Solon, who's a Methodist, and Matthew Tapey, who's a Catholic theologian. We're starting a new academic society called the Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology. The goal will be to bring together, in a way that hasn't been done before, theologians, biblical scholars from all different sorts of backgrounds, who are all operating in this same current of thought. And we're planning to launch that in about a year from now. Hopefully that'll allow us to have a greater sense, at least, of who are the theologians and scholars who identify in this way. And that, I think, will help bring a little bit more clarity to us. But I wish I could have just identified churches. But outside the Catholic world, I haven't been able to find many that I feel like bring these things together the way they do. Okay, on this side, in the back row.
Hi, Rabbi Mark. You had brought up the two house of Israel theory. And I have a quick question, then a quick statement, and then another quick question. First question I have is, do Messianic Jews believe in the restoration of the two houses of Israel? I.e. the stick of Judah and the stick of Joseph of Ezekiel 37, and several other places in Scripture referring to that. My statement is, some believe the stick of Joseph, also known as the Northern Kingdom, consists of many Hebrew peoples who, over many centuries, fell into idol worship, but eventually became Christians and came to the Christian faith. But they don't identify themselves as Jews. They're Hebrew descendants, but they don't identify themselves as Jews. but feel strongly linked to the Jews of the southern kingdom of Judah. That being said, my second question is, if this were true, wouldn't this be the very best form of bilateral ecclesiology?
Okay, in terms of the first question, I don't think the Messianic Jewish movement, that there is any consensus on this question, and to be frank, I've not heard very much discussion of it. And then, in terms of the second question, I think the crucial part is the conditional if. And my main question is, how would someone ever know? If these were Israelites who simply their identity was lost, then their identity is lost. And it becomes almost more of an object of faith to believe that somehow and that we can identify them. And so to be frank, and then this is just me, it's not, I'm not speaking for anybody else. This is my skepticism about it. You know, I think the reality of Israel is a reality that's fundamentally something that is the life of a people carried through time. And I think sometimes people are simply lost to Israel, you know, and it happens all the time. And there are, you know, how many Americans are there that have someone in their family tree who is Jewish? You know, but that doesn't make them Israel, and it doesn't make them Jewish. Sometimes, as I said, people who leave the Jewish people through and they simply are lost to the Jewish people. So I tend to think that the way I relate to the northern and southern kingdom in Scripture is more typologically. You know, I do think I see something prophetic about it, but the prophetic thing I see is the thing I think that is the kernel of truth in the two-house theory, that in a sense that the northern kingdom represents the church of the nations, and that ultimately that the bilateral ecclesiology is, and from that perspective, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. But I don't, there's a difference between seeing something as prophetic and typological, you know, as something God ordains, as a picture that tells us something about something else, rather than seeing it as this literally historical thing, such that the church itself is the descendant of the northern tribes. That's just my approach. Okay. Yes. Why don't you just pick someone?
Oh, thank you. Hi. My question is about Paul, or Rav Shaul. How come he went to Greece, to the non-Jews, instead of going to Israel and keeping the Messianic movement very Jewish, to start a Jewish foundation before going to Greece or whatever the other nation? And I believe Judaism, the Jews didn't assimilate, that's why Judaism is so strong. How come Paul all of a sudden decided to go to the non-Jews? And James, the brother of Yeshua, didn't agree with him. He told him, I want to keep the early Jewish movement. I don't know if it was a movement. The early Jewish followers of Yeshua keep it Torah observant, and Paul said no. I'm not sure if he said no exactly. So can you elaborate on that?
Yes. If we believe Paul's own report, what he says in numerous occasions, but especially in Galatians and Romans, is he went to the Gentiles because Yeshua told him to do it. You know, he says it was by revelation that just as Yeshua appeared to him and called him, then what Yeshua was doing was ordaining him and summoning him to go to the nations. And so then I think the picture you actually get, if you look at the text we just read, the text we read this morning, the text we read, what is this now? This is Friday. I'm sorry, I'm losing total contact. It was yesterday's text from the Jerusalem Council, Acts 15, and then the text we just read from Acts 21. In both of those texts, the pictures you get is James and Paul are in total agreement that they both are Torah observant Jews, and James is saying, my work is here, your work is there. We see it even just as clearly in Galatians chapter 2, where Paul describes this meeting that he has with Peter and with James, and where he says, we agreed that they would go to the circumcision, and that I would be going to the nations. And that, so this is treated there as if it's this twofold mission that is in effect then creating this twofold community. And so the impression you're getting here in Acts of the Apostles is that in its vision there was a harmony among the original leaders, and that what happens in terms of the contention and disruption is something that's a later development. So, over here, actually, why don't you come and bring these things forward, because the back rows have had all of the advantages because they're closer to the microphone. Why don't we start here, closer to the front?
Could you comment a little bit more on the line between Messianic Judaism and Jewish Christianity? So you spoke about seeing in terms of the world of Jewish followers of Yeshua in ecumenical type terms. And my question is, about that line, and do we accept a person or a community's self-definition as Messianic Jewish? What of communities that might not hold to a bilateral ecclesiological theology, and yet also don't fit into the type of community where the leader's Jewish and no one else, that sort of a thing. So just commenting a little bit more on the lines between Messianic Judaism and Jewish Christianity.
Yes. Yeah, that's a difficult question. There's a certain line which is obvious, and that was the one I was more leaning into in the presentation. That's the line between those who call themselves Messianic Jews and those who would call themselves Jewish Christians. Or even if they don't call themselves Jewish Christians as some sort of official title, they call themselves Jewish, and they also have no problem calling themselves Christians. And they have no problem calling the faith that they practice as Christianity. And so if somehow they're combining those things, I think of them as Jewish Christians, and it seems like that seems okay with them. I think one of the issues comes in and becomes problematic is sometimes those who have no problem with the term Jewish Christian to describe themselves also freely use the term Messianic Jew. That's more, I think, that's one of the things that introduces the challenge. For example, many in the missions world are like this. They have no problem with the term Christian or Jewish Christian to describe themselves, but they also will use the term Messianic Jew. Now, probably my approach would be to prefer then to use the term Messianic Jew for those of us who would take that for themselves, but not take the Jewish Christian term. And it's not so much they're denying them the title Messianic Jew. It's maybe more like having two different ways of using the same term. You know, we have to recognize there are lots of words and terms are not these, they don't designate simply one type of reality. This may be a little distraction, but it will illustrate the point. Think about the term Gentile. Think about the term Gentile in the way in particular it's used in the New Testament. Sometimes the term Gentile in the New Testament means anyone who's not a Jew. That's a common use. And in that context, so like in the book of Ephesians, Paul can say, or in Romans, I'm speaking to you Gentiles. But sometimes the term Gentile can mean pagan in such a way that it's not applied to those. And so in 1 Corinthians, Paul speaks about you who were formerly Gentiles. And there, what he's using the term Gentile in a different sense. You know, it means pagan. I think this something similar could even be said of the term Israel. You know, that the term Israel, obviously sometimes when you use the term Israel, we're talking about the state of Israel. Sometimes when we talk about Israel, we're referring to the Jewish people, and it could be distinguished from the church. I think that there's another usage of Israel that doesn't have to be supersessionist, as long as it's combined with the others, where Israel is this broadest reality that even encompasses the church as well as the Jewish people, and that doesn't have to be a problem. The problem is when you're saying it can only mean one of these things, you know. And so I think it's possible that the term Messianic Jew is a term like that, and that we just have to have different ways of using it. And that when we're using it in this sense of like Messianic Jews in relationship with Jewish Christians, we're talking about it as applying to those who only use that designation and wouldn't use the term Jewish Christian. But when we're in a room with our brothers and sisters from the missions world, and we're all relating as groups that also identify as the Messianic Jewish movement, we don't feel like we have to deny them the application of the term. So that, again, this doesn't answer all the questions, but I think it addresses some of the key parts. So Rabbi Rich, let's get the microphone here.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, I just want to make an observation that I think that context is everything. And when we're talking about going to different conferences, relating to different people, and trying to bring people together, we can offer a certain largesse and have a certain largesse and certain kind of expansive, very welcoming attitude, which really, distinctions are not what you're interested in doing. You're interested in bringing people together. But I just want to point out that another contextual issue has to do with community formation.
Yeah.
And community formation demands a certain consistency of basic language, basic terms, and basic meaning. It doesn't mean that you have a vocabulary test when you walk in, but I don't want to underplay the importance of particularity in these matters. And maybe you can comment a little bit, but it strikes me as an important element in the discussion.
Oh, certainly. I mean, that's central to what we're talking about in terms of bilateral ecclesiology. There has to be some kind of basic clarity here about environments that are Jewish environments. And then there's another element here too that I haven't emphasized at all, but I think it needs to be stated. Whenever you're talking about a relationship that is a relationship across certain kinds of lines, you know, a relationship we might have with Jewish Catholics or Jews in the Russian Orthodox Church. The thing that's novel to us right now is the fact that we would have any kind of relationship at all. And so what I'm stressing here is that we have something in common here. We have a Jewish identity that they can recognize as well, and we have a faith in Yeshua that they can recognize as well. And that's the new thing that I'm stressing here. But the reality is, too, which is just as important, we have distinctions. There are things that we hold that they don't hold, things that they hold that we don't hold. We're not pretending that they don't exist. We're not pretending that they're unimportant even. We're simply realizing that in the midst of a whole host of differences, we can still love one another and work together in various ways. And I think the same thing is true internal to the Messianic Jewish movement, that there are some lines that we have to draw. To draw a line is not intrinsically in itself divisive or has to break a relationship. But sometimes when you're forming a community, there's an inside and an outside, and that's the way it is. And we shouldn't be embarrassed about that. But again, I think sometimes, we can develop boundaries that are a blessing. Both in terms of Jew and Gentile, but also those boundaries in our relationships between Messianic Jews, understood in one way, and Jewish Christians. So, coming around this way. Again, I'm giving up on making the selections. I'm going to let you two who are holding the mics make the decisions. I'm going to put the burden on you.
Thank you, Dr. Kinzer. One question that I do see that is in the Gentile Christian world is the rise of the Hebrew roots movement.
Yes.
And you touched on two house, but I think the Hebrew roots movement would define itself differently than two house. Could you talk about that and what they're doing? And is it harmful for the Messianic Jewish movement, or is it like helping us in some way?
Yes. No, that was what I should have probably used the term, but that was what I was trying to talk about when I talked about this attraction to Judaism, Christian attraction to Judaism. And one of its expressions is this idea of Hebrew roots. Now, of course, the Hebrew roots, there's so many different manifestations here, so it's hard to make any blanket statement about it. I personally choose to see it as a good thing overall, as long as it can navigate within the parameters of those two fundamental principles that I was articulating, namely the honoring of the Jew-Gentile distinction on the one hand, and the honoring of the heritage of the church on the other. And I think those are the danger points that Hebrew roots, as well as other similar movements expressing a Christian attraction to Judaism, have. But I see all of these things as some work of the Spirit that is bringing to life something for the church in a way that has maybe never been the case since the very beginning, in a recognition of the importance of Judaism and the Jewish people. Now, it sometimes doesn't get worked out so well, but that doesn't mean that the impulse is wrong or in itself. Go on, Nathan.
Could you comment a little bit? You touched on it a bit in your answer to his question here, but could you comment a little bit on the term that's floating around, Messianic Gentile? And it's a term that I've encountered that seems to jettison the Christian identity, and yet still uphold some sense of appreciation for the wider church when it's done well. I'll say that, and within that realm of a distinction within covenantally, certain particulars which vary from community to community, and yet still, a vast majority non-Jewish.
Yes.
And my understanding is these communities see themselves as a part of the Jewish framework.
Yes.
If they were to adopt a bilateral framework,
Right.
which I'm not sure that they do.
Yeah.
But can you comment on that and how you see that in relationship to everything else?
Yes. I think that's a term that could that is both accurate and potentially helpful, and has been around for a while, to describe those Gentiles who are participating in what are attempted to be at least Jewish communal environments in the Messianic Jewish movement, and who are not converting to Judaism, ideally who are not simply taking on all of the aspects and accoutrements of Jewish life, but taking on a lot of them. That at least those parts that come from simply being part of a community that's a Jewish community, and so I've made the point that I think it's inevitable that there are going to be Gentiles in Messianic Jewish environments, just as there are going to be Jews in these Christian communal environments. And so then the question is, what are the basic rules that each of them follow, and how do they identify themselves, and how do they see themselves in relationship to the whole? Again, for me, the key ends up being those two basic principles. Do they... the very fact that they're using the term Messianic Gentile implies, I think, that they realize that the Jew-Gentile distinction is still important. And so they're not claiming to be a Jew. And that's positive. The fact that they call themselves Messianic hopefully means simply that they're living their life and feel called to be on that Jewish side of the Jewish communal environment. Hopefully it doesn't mean that they are negating the validity of the Christian church and Christian history. And as long as that's the case, I have no problem with the term, and I think the issues end up being, there's still a lot of then questions. Okay, how do they live? What's their role within the Messianic Jewish community? And how do we deal with situations where they vastly outnumber Jews within the community? And can you really have a Jewish community like that? So there become a lot of issues that get raised that are unanswered. But I think the term, I can't think of a better term to describe someone in that situation. Yeah.
So I had two questions. I think the first one might be kind of short and sweet. In your meetings with the different Catholic spaces in which Jews are gathering to be Jews, is there a similar type of confusion with Gentiles wanting to join in and take on some of that kind of role that you might see in the wider community that might be problematic or non-problematic? Do you see any critique there, or is it more just a first encounter, kind of really finding out more about this right now and less of a concern if that does exist? And the second question I had, which is maybe a little bit more dense, you've referenced Gentiles in the Messianic movement as being inevitable, but also much more of a support. Is there also a capacity that a Gentile in the Messianic movement could function not just as a support, but also as a hero within the Messianic world, the Jewish world?
Okay, with the first question, I want to be sure I understand it. So keep the microphone, because I need to ask you. Are you talking about, like in dealing with Catholics, the Gentile Catholics, and how are they relating? And are they being drawn to the Jewish Catholic? Is that what you meant, or
yeah,
what?
So like as these pools of Jewish expression and community within the Catholic Church are coalescing, are Gentiles being drawn into that and causing confusion?
Okay, yes. They do have some of the same challenges. Yeah, they do have some of the same challenges. It's interesting, in Israel, they have a particularly unique situation. Because the Jewish Catholics, they're organized more by language grouping. They are part of the Hebrew-speaking Catholic community in Israel. And so they have a separate, the Hebrew-speaking Catholic community in Israel has its own polity, its own distinct structures, as opposed to the Arabic-speaking. Yes, there are Arabic-speaking Catholics. But what that does is it brings the Jewish Catholics together with migrant workers from the Philippines and other places who come to Israel, work like through doing healthcare often, you know, for the elderly and things like that, and they end up speaking Hebrew, and they often have children, and their children grow up with Hebrew as their first language. And so you end up with these Catholic parishes that are having their liturgy all in Hebrew, but there may not be any Jews there. You know, it's a unique kind of development, also for that reason. That's especially in Tel Aviv and on the coast, as opposed to in Jerusalem. My impression in France, that there are non-Jews that are drawn and feel a special affinity, and because they haven't tried to develop congregations, or they haven't had the challenge of actually having to set up communities, so far they haven't had to deal with some of these really hard questions. But they will, I think. I think they'll have the same kinds of questions and issues as we do. Now, the second question, remind me what it was, late in the day for me. I'll remember as soon as you...
So can Gentiles within the Messianic Jewish...
Oh yeah, heroes. Yes. I think heroes is a good way of describing it. I mean, this is where probably my orientation is, you know, is simply mine alone. I mean, I don't claim it for even any of my colleagues in the MJRC or whatever, you know. My own orientation is that those Gentiles within the Messianic Jewish world should have the same kind of orientation that the original non-Jews who joined the movement at the very beginning should have had, which was one of having a sense of, we are here to support you. We are here to help this thing happen. We're not here to own it. We're not here to claim it for ourselves. We are here to sacrifice to make something happen for you. Now, to be honest with you, I think that's a pretty heroic thing. It's a self-sacrificing thing. It's to enter into a community where you don't have all of the privileges that the other people have, and you're doing that just in order to make it work for the other people. That's pretty remarkable. I think when you have people of true character who dedicate themselves, and we have people like this who have been around in the Messianic movement from the very, very beginning, and they are heroes, you know, and they should be held up, and they should be esteemed. But what they're esteemed for is the sacrifice that they make from themselves and their own identity in the process of subordinating something in their entry into the Messianic Jewish movement. So again, just my take, nothing more. Around here.
Thank you, Mark. I wanted to make a comment about the church and the Messianic movement moving closer together in the long term. That the Messianic movement is adding to the belief in Jesus, and they're becoming closer to the church, and the church is adding its belief in Israel and the chosen people, and they're becoming closer to Jews. Do you see when the Messiah comes, the church, them eventually converging, and maybe even soon, maybe in the next 20 years or so?
Oh, yeah, again, I'm no prophet, and I, particularly when it comes to eschatology, I make no forecasts of any sort. But what I see happening is this convergence. It's a convergence both, as you said, between the Messianic Jewish world and the church, but also more broadly between the church and the Jewish people. And that's the real significant thing. It's that the convergence of the Jewish people and the church as a whole. We as Messianic Jews, and I also think just as the Jews in the churches, the Jewish Christians, I think we need to understand ourselves as servants of this much bigger work. This is the real sense in which we are the part and not the whole. It's not that we are the end point. It's that we are servants of something much, much vaster that's going on that has to do with the future of Israel and the future of the church. But how and when, whether it's decades or whether it's centuries, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. Okay, Seth.
Perhaps one observation and characteristic of the current Christian landscape, in particular here in the United States, is an increasing polarization between what we might call conservative evangelicalism and what some might call more liberal mainline churches and that sort of thing. And often it seems to me that each perspective or position is often born out of a place of Yeshua faith and understanding of, Yeshua's teachings, the teachings of the Bible, etc. So my question is simply, as we seek to be a Yeshua Judaism, as you've pointed out, does this touch us, as a Yeshua Judaism? Obviously, oftentimes this plays out in the political realm. It plays out in terms of values expressed, morality, all of these sorts of things within, the secular society in which we live. So, does this touch us? If so, how? Do you have any reflections, or exhortations for us in the midst of this landscape? Because, I trust we too want to bring to bear or be informed, and motivated in many ways by our Yeshua Judaism in the way we engage our culture.
Well, again, we do have a whole session tomorrow on the secular landscape, which will give us a chance to look at that directly. I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question perfectly. What we deal, it's interesting, what you see in the church world is actually very similar to what you see in the Jewish world. The increasing divides between, on the one hand, Orthodox Judaism and the other more liberal forms of Judaism, which, when I was growing up, conservative Judaism was virtually indistinguishable from modern Orthodoxy. My wife grew up in modern Orthodoxy, and I grew up in conservative Judaism, and I can't really tell. The only difference from our experience as kids is that our synagogue had mixed seating of men and women, But even in our synagogue, the women weren't counted in the minyan and couldn't have aliyahs, and et cetera, Conservative Judaism was really not much different than modern Orthodoxy. The rabbi of our conservative synagogue that I grew up with had his ordination from Yeshiva University. And then a theologian like David Novak had his ordination through Jewish Theological Seminary, and then he went and served in a modern Orthodox congregation in Baltimore that was my wife's congregation, maybe in the 1970s. So a while back, these boundaries were much less clear. Whereas what's happened in the last 20 or 30 years is just this chasm growing up between the forms of Judaism, and that's of course a process that's been going on in the Protestant world for a long time, and interestingly enough, it's an internal divide in the Catholic world, where the thing that's so remarkable with them, they managed to contain it within one church body, which is pretty extraordinary, but actually. It's been growing, actually, in the pontificate of Francis. There's a tremendous reaction against Francis in the more conservative Catholic quarters. So what we see politically happening in America today is just, it's happening everywhere in all of these different types of settings. And it'd be easy to take an approach that just said, well, on the Jewish side, as I mentioned earlier, 40 years from now, the Orthodox will be the only one standing. On the Christian side, the evangelicals will be the only one standing. Liberal Protestantism is going down. I mean, it'd be possible to just kind of write off, the sides that look like they're ultimately going to fail. And there's a certain point to that, because we have to pay attention to why the certain sides are growing and other sides are failing. On the other hand, I think it would be a mistake to simply look at one side as having the truth and the other side as simply having none of the truth. And so to try to understand as much as possible both sides, it's as difficult as it is today in trying to do the same thing on the political scene. I mean, really, to try to be sympathetic to both Republicans and Democrats today, it's so hard. It really, And so, but I think it's a test of character for us to at least try to listen, to not become partisans, to be able to affirm truth as we see it wherever we see it, and be open to hearing it in unexpected quarters.
Mark, thank you so much. I'm going to take the liberty, actually, I want to say thank you to some folks in a few minutes. I want to take the liberty, though, there's an image that I've used to capture the essence of what Mark just said, and that has to do with holding on to both sides of an equation at the same time, because it's very difficult to do. So here's the image. Imagine Yeshua stretched, and I call it stretched between the polarities. He's stretched in this direction. He's on the execution stake on the cross. He's stretched this way. So he's stretched, and he's dying in that position. But then, of course, he's resurrected. So by way of a kind of midrashic treatment of it, I view us representing, God willing, an ever-increasing, maturing Messianic Judaism, which is able to be stretched between the polarities of opposite truth claims, both of which have some validity, and rather than finding the solution in a kind of retreat into one side of the equation or the other, which psychologically is easier but may not yield truth, we allow ourselves to experience a co-crucifixion with him, stretched between those polarities. We die with him in that we experience the discomfort of it all. It's a very hard place to be. But there's also the resurrection. And the resurrection to new and exciting possibilities that emerge because we have been willing to not allow ourselves to succumb to over-identification with one side or the other of the equation. So I leave that with you all, and especially you young people. May you be blessed as you try and fathom how to live this thing called Messianic Judaism in a very complicated world. Are the ladies still by the book table, the Aglow ladies? I just wanted to say a giant thank you. Are Sue and Victoria and Michelle out there? We want to say, where are they? There they are. Ladies, thank you so much. You have given your time for all these hours to be with us and help us by manning our book table, and we want to say a giant thank you, and God bless you all. And tell your gang to pray for Ruach Israel and for the Messianic Jewish movement. We have something to do, and it involves you, too. So, Baruch Hashem. Okay, we're going to break for up until 6 p.m. sharp. Dinner, Shabbat dinner then, and we'll have a lot of fun tonight as we just chill out and be with one another and have good food. So, shalom. See you a little bit later.